war of matter and spirit, which will afford him access to the Supreme Spirit, to the immutable, eternal Dharma, he will be deprived of his inherent capacity for action and struggle, and wallow in the mire of repeated birth and death, and of disgrace. Krishna then clarifies the nature of this disgrace.
Akirtim chapi bhutani kathayishyanti te vyayam sambhavitasya cha kirti maranadatirichyate.
And all will forever speak of your disgrace, and such disgrace is worse than death itself for a man of honor. People will long speak ill of Arjuna's unmanliness. Even today, sages like Vishwamitar, Parashar, Nimi, and Shringi are remembered chiefly for their transgressions of the path of righteousness. So worshippers reflect on their dharma. They think about what others will say of them. Such thought is helpful in the process of spiritual seeking. It provides the urge for persevering with the quest for the ultimate reality. It also provides support over a certain length of the spiritual way. Infamy is even worse than death for honorable men.
Bhayadranaduparatam mausyante tvam maharatha yesham cha tvam bahumato bhutva yasyasi laghavam.
Even the great warriors who have a high regard for you will then scorn you for having turned your back upon the war out of fear. The mighty warriors, in whose esteem Arjuna will then fall from honor to dishonor, will believe that he had retreated from the war due to cowardice. Who are these other great warriors? They too are seekers who make their way strenuously along the path of spiritual realization. The other formidable warriors who oppose them are, on the contrary, desire for sensual pleasure, anger, greed, and attachment that drag the worshipper with equal tenacity towards ignorance. Arjuna will be disgraced in the eyes of the very people who now hold him in high esteem as a worthy seeker. Apart from this,
Avaccha vadanscha bahu vadishyanti tavahita nindantastava samarthyam tato dukkhataram nukim.
There can be nothing more painful for you than the disparaging and improper words your adversaries will speak against your valor. His enemies will malign Arjuna and utter words about him that should not be spoken. A single blemish is sufficient to bring upon one a shower of slander and abuse from all directions. Even words improper for speech are spoken. Can there be a greater grief than being an object of such calumny? So Krishna tells Arjuna,
Ato va prapsyasi swargam jitva va bhokshase mahi tasmaduttishta kaunteya yuddhaya krita nishchaya.
Rise up with determination for the war, because if you die in it, you will attain to heaven, and if you win, you will attain to the most exalted glory. If Arjuna loses his life in the war, he will go to heaven and be with Saar, the indestructible God. the impulses that guide one towards the world of matter that is external to the self will be retarded, and his heart will then overflow with the divine qualities that enable one to realize the Supreme Spirit. In case he wins, however, he will attain to the state of redemption, the noblest accomplishment. So Krishna exhorts Arjuna to get up determinedly and prepare for war. Usually, by the verse under examination, it is understood that if Arjuna dies in the war, he will be privileged to live in heaven, but that if he is victorious, he will be rewarded with enjoyment of worldly pleasures. But we cannot but remember that Arjuna has told Krishna that in neither a realm made up of all the three worlds, nor even in an Indra-like lordship over gods, can he see the means that can remedy the grief that is wearing out his senses. If he is to achieve only all this, he has said, he will not fight at any cost. Nevertheless, Krishna exhorts him to fight. What greater reward than domination over the earth in case of victory and celestial pleasures in case of defeat does Krishna promise Arjuna in order to make him fight? Arjuna is, in fact, a disciple aiming at the truth and excellence that lie beyond earthly and heavenly joys. Knowing this, Krishna, the accomplished teacher, tells him that even if the time allotted to his body expires in the course of the war, and he does not succeed in reaching his goal, imbued with divine riches he will gain an existence in Saar, the changeless and eternal. If, on the other hand, he succeeds in the struggle, while his temporal body is still alive, he will achieve the sublimity of God and thus attain to the state of the highest glory. He will thus be a winner both ways. If he conquers, he will attain to the highest state, and if he loses, he will find an abode in heaven and enjoy godly pleasures. There is profit in victory, and there is profit also in defeat. The point is reiterated.
Samadukhe same kritva labha labho jaya jaya tato yuddhaya yujjasva naivam papamavapsyasi.
You will not incur sin if you get up and fight the war, treating victory and defeat, profit and loss, and happiness and sorrow alike. Krishna counsels Arjuna to regard with an equal mind happiness and sorrow, profit and loss, victory and defeat, and to prepare for war. If he participates in the war, he will not be guilty of sin. In the case of success, he will gain the state of sublimity, the most precious possession it is possible for a man to have, and achievement of godhood even in case of defeat. So Arjuna should deliberate well on his gains and losses and prepare for war.
Esha te bhihita sankhye buddhir yoge tvimam shrinu buddhya yukto yaya partha karma bandham prahasyasi.
This knowledge which I have imparted to you, O Parth, is related to Jnana Yoga, the way of knowledge. And now you should listen to me on Karma Yoga, the way of selfless action, with which you can successfully sever the fetters of action as well as its consequence, karma. Krishna tells Arjuna that the knowledge he has spoken of is related to the way of knowledge. What knowledge is it except that Arjuna should fight? The substance of the way of discrimination or knowledge is only that if we fight according to our disposition, after a careful appraisal of our capacity, as well as of profit and loss, we shall attain to the state of ultimate bliss if we win, and to heavenly godlike existence even if we are vanquished. There is gain in both cases. If we do not act, others will speak disparagingly of us and look upon us as having retreated like cowards, and we shall be disgraced. So to forge ahead on the path of action with a careful understanding of one's innate nature is itself the way of knowledge or discernment. We usually come across the misconception that no war needs to be fought on the path of knowledge. It is said that knowledge involves no action. We think in our vanity, I am pure, I am enlightened, I am a part of God Himself. Accepting it as an axiom that excellence begets excellence, we sit idly. But this is not the way of knowledge, according to Yogeshwar Krishna. The action which has to be performed in following the way of knowledge is similar to that which has to be undertaken for the way of selfless action. The only difference between the two ways is that of attitude. The man who treads the path of knowledge acts with a proper evaluation of his situation and with self-reliance, whereas the man who takes to the path of selfless action also acts, but with reliance upon the mercy of the revered God. Action is a basic requirement of both the ways, and in each of them it is the same, although it has to be done in two different ways. The attitudes behind the action in the two ways are different. So Krishna asks Arjuna to listen to him while he speaks of the way of selfless action, armed with which he can effectively destroy the bonds of action and its consequence. Here, the Yogeshwar has for the first time spoken of karma, although without explaining what it is.
नेहाभिक्रमनाशोऽस्ति प्रत्यवायो न विद्यते स्वल्पमप्यस्य धर्मस्य त्रायते महतो भयात्.
Since selfless action neither wears out the seed from which it sprang, nor has any adverse consequence, even a partial observance of this dharma liberates one from the dire terror of repeated birth and death. In the performance of action without coveting the fruits thereof, the initial impulse or the seed is not destroyed. It also does not give rise to any evil. So selfless action, even though done in small measures, frees us from the great fear represented by birth and death. That necessitates reflecting over the nature of such action and walking at least a few steps along its path. Worshippers who have renounced the vanity of earthly possessions have trodden this path, but so can those who lead the life of householders. Krishna tells Arjuna to just sow the seed, for the seed is never destroyed. There is no power in nature, no weapon which can destroy it. The material world can only cover it up momentarily and hide it for a while, but it cannot wipe out the initial inspiration, the seed of the act of spiritual accomplishment. According to Krishna, even the gravest of sinners can doubtlessly cross over by the arc of knowledge. He means exactly this when he says that if the seed of selfless action is just planted, it is imperishable. It does not even have any adverse outcome insomuch as it does not abandon us midway after showing us how we can progress towards spiritual attainment. Even if we give it up, it works doggedly on for our final liberation. This is why selfless action, even in a small measure, provides freedom from the great dread of birth and death. Once planted, even after repeated birth, the seed of such action takes us to the realization of God and to emancipation alike from pleasure and from pain. The question is, what we have to do if we choose the way of selfless action.
व्यवसायात्मिका बुद्धिः एकेह कुरु नन्दन बहुशाखाह्यनन्ताश्च बुद्धयो व्यवसायिनाम्.
On this auspicious path, O Kuru Nandan, Arjuna, the resolute mind is one, but the minds of the ignorant are divided and many. The mind, which is earnestly and firmly oriented to selfless action, is unified. Selfless action is only one, and its outcome is also one. Spiritual accomplishment is the only true achievement. The gradual realization of this attainment by fighting against forces of the material world is an enterprise. This enterprise and resolute action with a single goal are also one and the same. Then what about those who propagate more than one mode of action? In Krishna's view, they are not true worshippers. The minds of such men are endlessly divided, and that is why they conjure up endless ways.
Yamimam pushpitam vacham pravadantya vipaschitah vedavadarata partha nanyadastiti vadinah kamatmana Svargapara Janma Karma Phala Pradam Kriya Vishesha Bahulam Bhogaishwarya Gatim Prati.
Desire-ridden men, O Parth, who are given only to listening to Vedic promises of rewards for action, who believe that the attainment of heaven is the highest goal of temporal birth and its activities, and who speak pretentious words to describe the many rites and ceremonies that they regard as conducive to the achievements of worldly pleasure and power, are ignorant and bereft of discernment. The minds of such men are riddled with endless dissensions. Covetous and attached to the tempting promises made by Vedic verses, they regard heaven as the most sublime goal, and they believe in nothing beyond this. Such ignorant men not only devise numerous rites and ceremonies, the performance of which is expected to bring such rewards as the next birth, sensual enjoyment, and worldly dominion, but also flaunt them in flowery and affected language. To put it differently, the minds of men without discrimination have infinite divisions. They are addicted to precepts which promise fruits of action and accept the pledges of the Ved as final and authoritative. They regard heaven as the highest goal. Because their minds are split by many differences, they invent numerous modes of worship. They do speak of God, but behind the cover of His name, they build up a whole multitude of ritual ceremonies. Now, are these activities not a form of action? Krishna denies that these activities are true action. What then is true action? The question remains unanswered at this point. For the time being, Krishna only states that ignorant minds are divided minds, because of which they formulate an unlimited number of rites and ceremonies that are not real action. They not only expound them, but also give utterance to them in figurative language. Let us now see the effect of all this.
Bhogaishvarya prasaktanam taya parhita chetasam Vyavasayatmika buddhi samadhau na vidhiyate.
Delighted by ornamental words and attached to worldly pleasures and dominance, men without discrimination have irresolute minds. Minds which are affected by the tempting words of such people are also corrupted, and they also fail to accomplish what is worthwhile. The people whose minds are enamored of such words, and who are attached to sensual enjoyment and temporal power, are deprived of their capacity for action. They are bereft of resolve for the true action that is a prerequisite of contemplation of the worshipped God. But who are the people that lend their ears to these unwise men? Of course, rather than being knowers of the self within and the Supreme Spirit without, they are the ones who are addicted to sensual pleasure and temporal power. The minds of such men are lacking in will for the action that is needed for the ultimate union of the self with the Supreme Spirit. What exactly is the meaning of the assertion that they too are mistaken who are blindly devoted to Vedic pronouncements? Krishna speaks about this.
Traigunya Vishaya Veda Nistraigunyo Bhavarjuna Nirdvandvo Nitya Sattvastho Niryogakshema Atmavan.
Since all the Ved, O Arjuna, only illumine the three properties, you should rise above them. Be free from the contradictions of happiness and sorrow. Rest on that which is constant, and be unconcerned with getting what you do not have, as well as with protecting what you do have, in order to dedicate yourself to the self within. The Ved only illumine the three properties of nature. They know nothing of what is beyond them. So Arjuna should go beyond the sphere of action laid down by the Ved. How to do this? Krishna advises Arjuna to liberate himself from the conflicts of joy and sorrow, concentrate on the one changeless reality, and desire neither the unobtained nor the obtained, so that he may devote himself single-mindedly to the indwelling self. This is how he can rise above the Ved. But is there any precedence of anyone going beyond them? Krishna says that as a man transcends the Ved, even so he comes face to face with the Supreme Spirit, and that the man who is aware of him is a true Vipra, a Brahman.
Yavanartha udapani sarvatah samplutodake tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanasya vijanatah.
After the final absolution, a man does not need the Ved, just as we do not need a pond when there is the all-stretching ocean around. When a man is surrounded by the ocean on all sides, he has no use for a pond. Just so, a Brahman who has gained knowledge of the Supreme Spirit has no use for the Ved. That means that the one who knows God transcends the Ved, and that man is a Brahman. So Krishna counsels Arjuna to rise above the Ved and be a Brahman. Arjuna is a Kshatriya, and Krishna is exhorting him to be a Brahman. Brahman and Kshatriya are, among others, names of qualities that are inherent in the dispositions of different Varna, or what are now more commonly known as castes. But the Varna tradition is originally, as we have already seen, action-oriented, rather than a social provision determined by birth. What use has he for a petty pond who has availed himself of the crystal current of the Ganga? Some use a pond for ablution, while others wash their cattle in it. A sage who has known God by direct perception has the same kind of use for the Ved. They are undoubtedly useful. The Ved exists for stragglers who lag behind. Further elucidation of the problem begins from this point. Subsequently, Krishna expounds the precautions to be observed in the performance of action.
कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन मा कर्मफलहेतुर्भुर्मा ते सङ्गोऽस्त्वकर्मणि.
Since you are entitled only to the performance of action, but never to the fruits thereof, you should neither desire rewards of action, nor be drawn to inaction. Arjuna, Krishna says, has the right to action, but not to its results. So Arjuna should persuade himself that fruits of action simply do not exist. He should not covet these fruits, and neither should he grow disillusioned with action. So far, Krishna has first used the term action, karma, meaning both action and its consequence, in the 39th verse of the chapter, but he has not indicated what this karma is and how to perform it. He has, however, described its characteristic traits. First, he has told Arjuna that by the performance of action, he will be freed from the bonds of action. Second, he has then said that the seed or initial impulse of action is indestructible. Once it is initiated, nature has no means to destroy it. Third, there is, Arjuna has been told, not even the slightest flaw in this action, for it never abandons us while we are stranded amidst the temptations of celestial pleasures and worldly affluence. Fourth, performance of this action, even in small proportions, can emancipate us from the great fear of birth and death. But, as is evident from the summary above, Krishna has not so far defined action. As for the way of doing it, he has said in the 41st verse, "The mind which is resolved to do this action is only one, and the way of doing it is also only one." Does it mean, then, that people engaged in other multifarious activities are not really engaged in the worship of God? According to Krishna, the activities of such people are not action. Explaining why it is so, he adds that the minds of men without discernment are riven by endless divisions, because of which they tend to invent and elaborate an unlimited number of rites and ceremonies. So they are not true worshippers. They use pretentious and ornate language to describe these rites and ceremonies. So that man's mind is also poisoned who is lured by the charm of their words. The ordained action is therefore only one, although we have not yet been told what precisely it is. In the 47th verse, Krishna has told Arjuna that he has a right to action but not to its fruits. So Arjuna should not desire these fruits. At the same time, he ought not to lose faith in the performance of action. In other words, he should be constantly and devotedly engaged in its performance. But Krishna has not yet said what this action is. Verse is usually interpreted as meaning, "Do whatever you wish, only do not desire its fruits." That is, say those who interpret the verse thus, what selfless action is all about. In fact, however, Krishna has not so far told us what this action is that men are required to do. He has so far elaborated only its characteristics, what the gains from it are, and the precautions that have to be observed in the course of its performance. Yet the question of what exactly selfless action is has so far remained unanswered. It is, in fact, answered only in chapters 3 and 4. Krishna again reverts to what he has already said.
Yogastha kuru karmani sangam tyaktva dhananjaya siddhya siddhyo samo bhutva samatvam yoga uchyate.
The equipoise of mind that arises from profound absorption in the performance of action, after renouncing attachment and being even-minded in respect of success and failure, is, O Dhananjay, Arjuna, given the name of yoga. Resting in yoga, renouncing infatuation for worldly ties, and looking at success and failure with an equal mind, Arjuna should undertake action. But what action? Krishna's pronouncement is that men should do selfless action. Equipoise of mind is what is called yoga. The mind in which there is no unevenness is full of equanimity. Greed destroys its evenness, attachments make it unequal, and desire for the fruits of action destroy its serenity. That is why there should be no hankering after the fruits of action. At the same time, however, there should also be no diminishing of faith in the performance of action. Renouncing attachment to all things, seen as well as unseen, and giving up all concern about achievement and non-achievement, we should only keep our eyes fixed on yoga, the discipline that joins the individual soul with the Supreme Spirit, and lead a life of strenuous action. Yoga is thus the state of culmination, but it is also the initial stage. At the outset, our eyes should be fixed on the goal. It is for this reason that we should act keeping our eyes on yoga. Equanimity of mind is also named yoga. When the mind cannot be shaken by failure and success, and nothing can destroy its evenness, it is said to be in the state of yoga. It cannot then be moved by passion. Such a state of mind enables the soul to identify himself with God. This is another reason why this state is called Samatva Yoga, the discipline that makes the mind full of equanimity. Since there is in such a state of mind complete renunciation of desire, it is also called the way of selfless action, Nishkam Karma Yoga. Since it requires us to perform action, it is also known as the way of action, Karma Yoga. Since it unites the self with the Supreme Spirit, it is called yoga. It is necessary to keep in mind that both success and failure should be viewed with equanimity, that there should be no sense of attachment, and that there is no desire for the rewards of action. It is thus that the way of selfless action and the way of knowledge are the same.
Durena hyavaram karma buddhi yoga dhananjaya buddhau sharanam vichcha kripana phalahetavaha.
Take refuge in the way of equanimity, yoga, Dhananjay, because action with desire for the fruits thereof is far inferior to the path of discrimination, and they are indeed paupers who are motivated by lust for rewards. Covetous action is distant from and inferior to the path of discrimination. Those who yearn after praise are wretched men, vile and devoid of judgment. Arjuna is therefore urged to find shelter in the even-minded way of knowledge. Even if the soul is rewarded with what he desires, he will have to assume a body in order to enjoy it. So long as the process of coming and going, of birth and death lasts, how can there be ultimate redemption? A seeker should not desire even absolution, for absolution is total freedom from passions. Thinking over the acquisition of rewards, if he gets any, his worship is interrupted. Why should he now continue any further with the task of meditation on God? He goes astray. So yoga should be observed with a perfectly even mind. Krishna describes the way of knowledge, Gyan Karm Sannyas Yoga, as also the Buddhi or Sankhya Yoga. He suggests to Arjuna that he has attempted to enlighten him on the nature of discrimination in its relation to the way of knowledge. In truth, the only difference between the two is that of attitude. In the one has to proceed only after making a proper examination of the constructive and negative aspects of the undertaking, while in the other also, equanimity has to be preserved. So it is also called the way of equanimity and discrimination, Samatva Buddhi Yoga. Because of this, and because men possessed of desire for rewards are reduced to miserable wretchedness, Arjuna is advised to find shelter in the way of knowledge.
Buddhi yukto jahatiha ubhe sukrita dushkrite tasmad yogaya yujjasva yoga karmasu kaushalam.
As the soul endowed with a mind of equanimity renounces both meritorious and evil deeds in this world itself, and the art of acting with equipoise is yoga, the endeavor to master the way of equanimity, of discrimination, is samatva yoga. Stoic minds give up both the sacred and the sinful in this life itself. They adopt an attitude of detachment to both. So Arjuna should strive for the equanimity of mind that is derived from the way of knowledge. Yoga is the skill of acting with equipoise. Two attitudes towards action prevail in the world. If people do a work, they also wish for its fruits. If there are no rewards, they may not even like to work. But Yogeshwar Krishna regards such action as bondage and states that worship of the one God is the only worthwhile action. In the present chapter, he has only named action. Its definition is given in the 9th verse of chapter 3, and its nature is dwelt upon at length in chapter 4. In the verse about to be quoted, the skill of acting in freedom from worldly customs is that we should perform action and do it with dedication, but at the same time with voluntary renunciation of any right to its fruits. However, it is but natural to be curious about what will become of these fruits. But of course, there is no doubt that selfless action is the right way of action. The whole energy of the desireless worshipper is then directed to his action. The human body is meant for worship of God. At the same time, though, one would like to know whether one has just always to go on acting, or whether the performed action will also produce some result. Krishna now dwells upon this problem.
Karmajam buddhi yuktahi phalam tyaktva manishinah janma bandha vinirmuktaah padam gacchantyanāmayam.
Renouncing all desire for the fruits of their action, and thus freed from the bondage of birth, wise men who are skilled in the way of equanimity and discrimination achieve the pure, immortal state. Wise men endowed with the yoga of discrimination renounce the fruits arising from their action and are liberated from the bondage of birth and death. They achieve the pure, immortal state of oneness with God. Application of intellect is categorized here into three kinds. First, by the way of discrimination, in verses 31 to 39. This yields two results: divine riches and ultimate bliss. Second, by the way of selfless action, in verses 39 to 51, which produces only one consequence: liberation from the dire terror of repeated birth and death by attaining immaculate, indestructible oneness with God. These are the only two ways described for true yoga. The third type of application of intellect is done by the ignorant, who are engaged in other endless modes of action and who fall into the cycles of repeated birth and death according to their deeds. Arjuna's vision is limited only to acquisition of sovereignty over the three worlds and even over gods. But even for the sake of these, he is not inclined to war. At this point, Krishna reveals to him the truth that a man can attain to the immortal state through selfless action. The way of selfless action also provides access to the highest state of being, which death cannot break into. At what point, though, will a man be inclined to the performance of such action?
Yada te moha kalilam buddhir vyatitarishyati tada gantasi nirvedam shrotavyasya shrutasya cha.
At the time when your mind has successfully made its way across the swamp of attachment, you will be capable of the renunciation, which is worth hearing of and which you have heard. The very moment Arjuna's mind, indeed the mind of any worshipper, has steered safely across the marsh of attachment, it will then be receptive, not only to what is proper for hearing, but also to the idea of renunciation, making it an integral part of its action according to what it has learnt. At the present moment, however, Arjuna is unprepared to listen to what is proper for hearing, and so the question of its influencing his conduct, of course, simply does not arise. Krishna again illumines the same worthiness.
Shruti vipratipanna te yada sthasyati nischala samadhavachala buddhi tada yogamavapsyasi.
When your mind, now shaken by the conflicting precepts of the Ved, achieves a changeless and constant existence within the being of Supreme Spirit, you will then attain to immortal state through profound meditation. When Arjuna's mind, at present riven through and through by the contradictory teachings of the Ved, achieves the state of steady contemplation of God, it will become changeless and constant, and then he will master the skill of discrimination and equanimity. He will then achieve the perfect equilibrium, which is the ultimate state of immortality. This is the crowning point of yoga. The Ved undoubtedly instructs us, but as Krishna points out, The contradictory injunctions of the Shruti confuse the mind. Precepts there are many, but it is unfortunate that people usually keep away from the knowledge that is fit for learning. Arjuna is told that he will reach the stage of immortality, the culmination of yoga, when his agitated mind achieves constancy by meditation. This naturally whets Arjuna's curiosity about the nature of sages who exist in an exalted state of perfect spiritual bliss, and whose minds are immovable and at peace in the state of abstract meditation. So he asks Krishna,
स्थितप्रज्ञस्य का भाषा समाधिस्थस्य केशव स्थितधिः किं प्रभाषेत किमासीत व्रजेत किम्.
Arjuna said, "What, O Keshav, is the mark of the man who has attained to the state of true meditation and equanimity of mind? And how does this man with firm discrimination speak, sit, and walk?" That soul which has resolved his doubts is in the state of samadhi, or perfect absorption of thought, in the Supreme Spirit, the one worthy object of meditation. One who has achieved equanimity and discrimination by identification with the eternal essence, which has neither a beginning nor an end, is said to be in the state of abstract contemplation of the nature of the Supreme Spirit. Arjuna asks Krishna for the qualities of the man with a mind of equanimity engaged in such contemplation. How does a man with steadfast wisdom speak? How does he sit? What is his gait? Arjuna has thus asked 4 questions. Thereupon Krishna says,
प्रजहाति यदा कामान् सर्वान् पार्थमनोगतान् आत्मन्येवात्मना तुष्टः स्थितप्रज्ञस्तदुच्यते.
The Lord said, "A man is then said to be steadfast in mind when he has renounced all the desires of his mind and achieved contentment of the self through the self." When a man has renounced all his desires and achieved his soul's contentment through the contemplation of his soul, he is said to be a man of firm discernment. This self is apprehended only through complete abandonment of passion. The sage who has viewed the ineffable beauty of his self and found perfect satisfaction in him is the man with a steady judgment.
दुःखेष्वनुद्विग्नमनाः सुखेषु विगतस्पृहः वीतरागभयक्रोधः स्थितधीर्मुनिरुच्यते.
He is indeed a steady-minded sage who is unmoved by sorrow and indifferent to happiness, and who has overcome his passions, fear, and anger. He whose mind is untroubled by bodily, accidental, and worldly sorrows, and who has rid himself of desire for physical pleasures, and whose passions, fear, and anger have been subdued, is the sage with discrimination, who has achieved the culmination of spiritual discipline. Krishna then points out other qualities of this saintly man.
यः सर्वत्रानभिस्नेहः तत्तत् प्राप्य शुभाशुभम् नाभिनन्दति न द्वेष्टि तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता.
That man has a steady mind who is entirely free from attachment, and who neither gloats over success nor abhors failure. That man has a firm wisdom who is totally free from infatuation, and who neither welcomes good fortune nor repudiates misfortune. That alone is auspicious, which draws a soul to the being of God, whereas that which pulls the mind to temptations of the material world is inauspicious. The man of discrimination is not too happy in favorable circumstances, and he also does not scorn adversities, because neither is the object which is fit for attainment different from him, nor is there for him any evil that may sully the purity of his mind. That is to say, that he has now no need for further striving.
Yada samharate chayam kurmonganiva sarvashah indriyani indriyarthebhyah tasya pragya pratisthita.
As a turtle pulls in its limbs, this man reins in his senses from all objects, and then he truly has a steady mind. When a man pulls back his senses from all sides and restrains them within his mind, like a turtle pulling its head and feet within its shell, his mind is steady. But this is only an analogy. As soon as the turtle knows that the danger is gone, it again expands its limbs. Does a man of steadfast wisdom also, in the same way, let his senses loose after restraining them, and resume enjoyment of worldly pleasures?
Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinah rasavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate.
While objects of sensual pleasure cease to be for the man who withdraws his senses from them, his desire for these objects yet remains. But the desires of the man of discrimination are completely erased by his perception of God. The objects of sense come to an end for the man who has rejected them because his senses no longer perceive them, but his desires yet survive. The feeling of attachment lives on. But the passions of the yogi, the doer of selfless action, are annihilated by his perception of the ultimate essence that is God. The accomplished or enlightened sage does not, like the turtle, re-extend his senses to objects which are pleasing to them. When once his senses have shriveled, all the influences and impressions, sanskar, he has carried with him from a previous existence are irrevocably dead. His senses do not then return to life. By apprehending God through the observance of the way of selfless action, even the attachments to objects of sensual pleasure become extinct. Force has often been a feature of meditation, and by its use seekers rid themselves of objects of sense. But thoughts of these objects persist. These attachments are brought to an end only with the perception of God and never before that, because before this stage, residues of matter persist. In this connection, my most revered teacher, Sri Parma Anandji, used to cite an event from his own life. He had heard 3 voices from heaven when he was about to give up home. We respectfully asked him why these voices from heaven came to him alone. There had not been any for us. He replied that he too had had the same doubt. But then he had an intuition, that he had been an ascetic during his last 7 births. During the first 4 of these, he had only roamed about garbed in a holy man's paraphernalia, with a sandal paste mark on his forehead, ash rubbed on his body, and carrying the water pot used by ascetics. He had then lived in ignorance of yoga. But during the last 3 births, he had been a true saint, as such a soul should be, and there was now the awakening of the way of yoga in him. In the last life, final liberation had been almost at hand, and the end was in view, but a couple of his desires had remained. Although he had firmly controlled his outward body, there were these passions within him. That was why he had to go through yet another birth. And in this birth, within a limited time, God had freed him from all his passions, rendered him 2 resounding slaps, as it were, by providing him with all sights and sounds, and made him a true ascetic. Krishna means precisely the same when he proclaims that although a man's association with objects of sense ends when he restrains them from reacting to these objects, he is rid of desire for these objects only when he knows his own self as the identical God through meditation. So we have to act until we have achieved this perception. Goswami Tulsidas has also said that at first there are passions in the heart, which are swept away only by true devotion to God. Krishna speaks about how difficult it is to withdraw the senses from their objects.
Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha tani sarvani sayyamya yukta asita matparaha vashehi yasyendriyani tasya pragya pratishtita.
O son of Kunti, men ought to subdue their senses, which seize forcibly even wise and striving minds, and devote themselves to me with perfect concentration, because only that man's mind is unwavering who has achieved control of his senses. Mutinous senses ravish even discerning and active minds, and undo their steadiness. So with full control over his senses, equipped with yoga and devotion, Arjuna should find shelter in God, of whom Krishna is an incarnation, for that man alone has a firm mind who has subdued his senses. Here, Yogeshwar Krishna explains what ought to be prevented in the course of worship, as also the components of spiritual seeking which it is the duty of men to undertake. Restraint and prohibition alone cannot subdue the senses. Along with negation of senses, there must also be incessant contemplation of the desired God. In the absence of such reflection, the mind will be preoccupied with material objects, the evil consequence of which we see in the words of Krishna himself.
Dhyayato vishayan pumsah sangasteshu pajayate sangat samjayate kamah kamat krodho bhijayate.
They whose thoughts are of sensual objects are attached to them. Attachment gives rise to desires, and anger is born when these desires are obstructed. The feeling of attachment persists in men who have not yet got over their concern with the objects of sense. Desire is born from attachment, And there is anger when there is an obstacle in the way of satisfaction of desire. And what does the feeling of anger give rise to?
Krodhad bhavati sammohah, sammohat smriti vibhramah, smriti bhranshad buddhinasho, buddhinashat pranashyati.
Delusion is born from anger, by which memory is confused. Confusion of memory undermines the faculty of discrimination. And when discrimination is lost, the seeker deviates from the means of absolution. Confusion and ignorance arise from anger. Distinction between the eternal and the transient is obliterated. Remembrance is shaken by delusion, as it happens with Arjuna. Krishna says again that in such a state of mind one cannot determine wisely what to do and what not to do. Confusion of memory weakens the seeker's dedication, and loss of discrimination makes him deviate from his goal of being one with God. Here Krishna has emphasized the importance of cultivating unconcern with sensual objects. The worshipper's mind should rather always be concerned with that, whether it be word, form, incarnation, or abode, by which his mind may be enabled to be one with God. The mind is drawn to sensual objects when the discipline of worship is relaxed. Thoughts of these objects produce attachment, which in its own turn results in desire for them. Anger is generated if the satisfaction of this desire is obstructed in any way, and ignorance finally undoes the power of discernment. The way of selfless action is also said to be the way of knowledge, for it has always to be kept in view that desire must not be allowed to enter the worshipper's mind. There are, after all, no real fruits. Advent of desire is inimical to wisdom. Steady contemplation is therefore a necessity. A man who does not always think of God strays from the right path that will lead him to ultimate bliss and glory. However, there is one consolation. The chain of worship is only broken, not completely destroyed. Once the joy of worship has been experienced, when taken up again, it resumes from the same point at which it was discontinued. This is the fate of the worshipper who is attached to sensual objects. But what is the lot of the seeker who has mastered his mind and heart?
रागद्वेषवियुक्तैस्तु विषयानीन्द्रियैश्चरन् आत्मवश्यैर्विधेयात्मा प्रसादमधिगच्छति.
But that man achieves spiritual tranquility who has mastered his mind, and who remains unaffected by sense objects, although he may be roaming amidst them, because his senses are properly restrained. Possessed of the means of spiritual realization, the sage who has experienced an intuitive perception of the identity of self and the Supreme Spirit achieves the state of the most sublime peace, because he has subdued his senses and therefore remained untouched by their objects, even though he may be wandering in their midst. No prohibitions are needed for such a man. There is for him nothing unpropitious anywhere against which he should fight and defend himself. There is also for him no good for which he should yearn.
Prasade sarva dukkhanam hanirasyopajayate prasanna chetaso yashu buddhi paryavatishthate.
After realizing the ultimate repose, all the seeker's sorrows disappear, and the blissful mind of such a man quickly grows in firmness. Blessed with a vision of God's ineffable glory and His divine grace, all the worshipper's griefs, the temporal world and its objects which are the abode of all sorrows, vanish, and his power of discrimination grows strong and steady. Hereafter Krishna dwells upon the lot of those who have not achieved the saintly condition.
Nasti buddhirayuktasya na chayuktasya bhavana na chabhavayatah shanti ashantasya kutah sukham.
A man without spiritual accomplishment has no wisdom nor true faith. How can such men be happy? A man who has not undertaken meditation is devoid of selfless, action-oriented wisdom. This impoverished man is even deficient in the feeling of devotion to the all-pervading Spirit. How can such a man, without an awareness of the self within and the God without, be at peace? And how can he, without peace, experience happiness? There can be no devotion without knowing the object of devotion, and knowledge comes from contemplation. Without devotion, there can be no peace, and a man with a disturbed mind cannot experience happiness, much less the state of changeless, eternal bliss.
Indriyanam hi charatam yanmano nuvidhiyate tadasya harati pragyam vayurnavamivambhasi.
For as the wind captures the boat on water, just so, even one of the senses that roam amidst objects of their gratification and with which the intellect dwells, is strong enough to sweep away the discrimination of one who is unpossessed of spiritual attainment. As the wind drives a boat far away from its destination, even one out of the five senses, roving amongst objects perceived by the intellect, can get hold of the man who has not undertaken the task of spiritual quest and discipline. Therefore, incessant remembrance of God is essential. Krishna again dwells upon the importance of action-oriented conduct.
Tasmadyasya mahabaho nigrihitani sarvashah indriyani indriyarthebhyah tasya pragya pratisthita.
Therefore, O the mighty-armed Arjuna, the man who prevents his senses from straying to objects has a steady discrimination. The man who restricts his senses from being drawn to their objects is a man of steady wisdom. The word arm, as used here, is a measure of the sphere of action. God is called mighty-armed Mahabahu, although he is bodiless and works everywhere without hands and feet. The one who becomes one with him, or is inclined to him, and is on the way to his sublime splendor, is also therefore mighty-armed. That is the significance of the use of this epithet for both Krishna and Arjuna.
Ya nisha sarva bhutanam tasyam jagarti sayyami yasyam jagrati bhutani sa nisha pashyato muni.
The true worshipper, yogi, remains awake amidst what is night for all creatures. But the perishable and transient worldly pleasures amidst which all living creatures stay awake are like night for the sage who has perceived reality. The transcendental spirit is like night for living beings because he can be neither seen nor comprehended by thought. So he is like night. But it is in this night that the spiritually conscious man remains awake, because he has seen the formless and known the incomprehensible. The seeker finds access to God through control of senses, peace of mind, and meditation. That is why the perishable worldly pleasures for which living beings toil day after day is night for God's true worshipper. The sage alone, who beholds the individual self and the universal self, and is indifferent to desire, succeeds in his enterprise of God realization. So he dwells in the world and is yet untouched by it. Let us now see what Krishna has to say on the way in which this exalted sage conducts himself.
Apuryamana pratishtham samudramapah pravishanti yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashanti mapnoti na kamakami.
As the water of many rivers falls into the full and ever-constant ocean without affecting its tranquility, even so the pleasures of sense merge into a man of steady discrimination without producing any deviation, and such a man attains to the state of the most sublime peace rather than yearn for sensual enjoyment. The full and changeless ocean assimilates all the rivers that flow violently into it without losing its repose. Similarly, the man who is aware of the oneness of his self and the Supreme Spirit assimilates all worldly pleasures within himself without in any way straying from his chosen path. Rather than longing for sensual gratification, he aims at the achievement of the most sublime bliss of uniting his self with the Supreme God. Ravaging everything that comes in their way, crops, men, and animals, and their habitations, and with a frightening roar, the violently sweeping currents of hundreds of rivers fall into the ocean with a tremendous force, but they can neither raise nor lower its level by even an inch. They only merge into the ocean. In the same violent way, sensual pleasures assault the sage who has attained knowledge of reality and merge in him. They can impress on him neither weal nor woe. The actions of a worshipper are non-good and non-evil. They transcend good and evil. The minds which are conscious of God, restrained and dissolved, bear only the mark of divine excellence. So how can any other impression be made on such a mind? In this one verse, then, Krishna has answered several of Arjuna's queries. Arjuna was curious to learn the mark of a sage who knows the divine reality, how he speaks, how he sits, how he walks. With the single word, ocean, the omniscient Krishna answers all these questions. The mark of a sage is that he is like an ocean. Like an ocean, he is not bound by rules, that he must sit like this and walk like that. It is men like him who achieve the ultimate peace, for they have self-control. They who yearn for pleasure can have no peace.
Vihaya kamanyah sarvan pumanscharati nispruhah nirmamo nirahankarah sashanti madhigacchati.
The man who has renounced all desire and who conducts himself without ego, arrogance, and attachment is the one who achieves peace. Men who have given up all desire and whose actions are entirely free from the feelings of I and mine realize the ultimate peace beyond which there is nothing to strive for and achieve.
एषा ब्राह्मी स्थितिः पार्थ नैनां प्राप्य विमुह्यति स्थित्वा स्यामन्तकालेऽपि ब्रह्मनिर्वाणमृच्छति.
Such, O Arjuna, is the steadfastness of the man who has realized God. After attaining to this state, he subdues all temptation, and resting firmly in his faith, with his death, he continues in this state of rapture of the union of his self with God. Such is the state of one who has realized God. Rivers of temporal objects merge into these ocean-like sages who are endowed with self-control and an intuitive perception of God. Conclusion. In this chapter, as we have seen, by expounding the merits of action and by indicating the precautions to be observed in the performance of action, as well as the characteristic marks of the sage who has gained direct knowledge of the self and God through perception, Krishna has aroused Arjuna's curiosity and also answered some of his queries. The self is immutable and eternal. Arjuna is exhorted to know it in order to learn reality. There are two ways of acquiring this knowledge: the way of discrimination or knowledge, and the way of selfless action. Krishna says that he has two kinds of devotees. There is first the follower of the way of knowledge, Gyanmargi. Secondly, there is the follower of the way of devotion, Bhakti Margi. The man of devotion, or doer of selfless action, finds refuge in God and proceeds on his chosen path with total dependence on His grace. Possessed of confidence in his own strength, on the contrary, the man of discrimination goes along his way after making a proper evaluation of his own ability as well as of the profit and loss in the enterprise. But the two have a common goal and the same enemies. Not only the man of discrimination, but also the man of devotion has to overcome the same adversaries, namely anger, desire, and other impieties. Both of them have to renounce desire, and the action, too, that has to be performed under both the disciplines is one and the same. Thus concludes the second chapter in the Upanishad of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita on the knowledge of the Supreme Spirit, the science of yoga, and the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, entitled Karma Jigyasa, or Curiosity about Action. Thus concludes Swami Adgadanand's exposition of the second chapter of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita in Yatharth Geeta. Hare Om Tat Sat.